What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of the Muscle Memoirs Podcast. We have a fantastic episode for you today. I'm super excited to be with Steve Hall from Revive Stronger and AJ Morris from Made by Morris Coaching. How you fellas doing?
We're good. I think we're both hot, but AJ is doing all right because he's cutting. And I always think like contest prep when it's hot is that's the best combination. Whereas I decided to throw in the towel because, I was too unsure about everything. And I just thought, why not just pack on mass? So I'm doing better than I would be if I was up at 200 pounds. So anyway, I'll let AJ answer.
Yeah, no, you nailed it. Yeah, I'm good. It's been a breeze of a week, to be honest, because last week I was like finding myself getting hungry, and I was like, oh God, it's kicking in now. And then this week I've just cruised through it. It's like not like I've taken off a couple of pounds, and it's felt like nothing. So I just hope that it stays 30 degrees for the rest of prep in some ways. But it does fatigue you a little bit for work. When you're at I'm sure you agree, Steve, when you're at the laptop all day and it's really hot, you kind of get a bit of brain fog and things like that. But other than that, I'm good. Thank you.
That's fantastic. Yeah, Steve, in the same situation over here, due to the uncertainty of things and a couple of my shows for the season getting canceled, I ended up wrapping up prep. But the vast majority of my prep was during the winter months. Huge mistake, was awful, especially because I train at home in a basement with no heating, so that was lovely.
Oh my God. That's horrendous.
Well, with that out of the way, just to provide a little bit of context for this episode for everyone. So basically, by the looks of it, the two of you are making some noise in the natural bodybuilding community. AJ, you mentioned you're currently dieting. Steve, you're not anymore, but you did recently have a dieting phase, and the both of you are looking absolutely fantastic. So, which means that you've had a pretty successful recent off season, and dare I say, the most successful off season of your bodybuilding careers. So we kind of want to dive into today your training and nutrition strategies, what you guys have personally done, what you've learned during this process, what you've done differently this time around. And so let's jump right into things. The first question we have is basically, how long was your most recent off season? What was your peak body weight during that off season, and how does that compare to your peak body weight in previous off seasons? Steve, how about you start us off?
Yeah, sure thing. So funny enough, I've got the opposite training environment at the moment because it's 30 degrees outside and I'm training in this flat which holds all the heat. So I'm just sweating buckets, and because I train twice and split my sessions twice, it's like the amount of washing and everything I have to do every day. But anyway, regardless, I'm actually interested. I think because me and AJ competed last both in 2017, so we both had kind of the same length of off season. I can't remember what AJ's top peak weight was, but I don't know if it's too dissimilar from mine. I got up to, I think the peak, I don't know if I touched like 200 and I think I got to 203 pounds or something, but 200 pounds, I touched that twice and maintained that for a period of time, which was a lot more than I'd had in previous off seasons. So in the past, I'd only got up to 185 pounds, which is where I am now, which seems ridiculous saying it. So that was not much over even stage weight. I was 15 pounds over stage weight before that, 185 pounds, whereas obviously going up to 200 pounds, that was a solid like 30 pounds above stage weight. So it was a big difference for me. It took a big mentality shift, and I couldn't be happier to have done it. And I'm very adamant of sharing that process. I think there's limits to how far you should push, but I'm very glad that I took that extra leap to go that distance. So yeah, it was a very productive off season for me.
Yeah, sort of similar to Steve in a way. Obviously, we competed in 2017 together, and we've both had very similar off-season lengths. It's a shame that we're not both stepping on stage this year. It would have been really nice to sort of do that and work in the same sort of paradigm, so to speak. But nevertheless, my peak off-season weight before my 2017 prep was about 184 pounds, and this past off-season I got up to 196 pounds. So I'm just a big advocate I think I always kind of have been to a degree, but just through what I've done naturally. But I think through following certain people on social media and learning more about what really builds new muscle is that you've got to, just like a prep, it gets a little hard at the end when you're digging off the final bits of body fat. You've got to kind of get a little bit comfortable being uncomfortable at the higher ends of the body fat thresholds in an off season. So I was very soft at 196 pounds, and you only realize in hindsight how soft you were when you look back and you've started to get lean. You're like, oh geez, that was a bit heavy there, but it was very productive, just like Steve said. And I think even sometimes when people are pushing up to those weights, they think that they're not getting much performance benefit, but there is always some slight performance benefit of being that little bit heavier. Whether you see it initially or you see it in the long run, it always tends to come. And whether it's just the consistency of things feeling good, because sometimes you diet down, like I'm down now and some of my performance is getting better still. So you're like, why did I push that heavy? But there's always a reason. Yeah, that was sort of like peak off season length, and in terms of body weight lengthwise, it was the same as Steve. It was, of course, the 2 years that we took off. So yeah, I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, absolutely. So each of you had like a roughly 3-year off season, and a common thing I'm seeing between the two of you is that you've reached new all-time peaks in your body weight during this off season, which I think is pretty fascinating because nowadays this is almost a unique concept, right? So you both have pretty substantial followings on social media, and basically social media has created this construct where if you're part of this fitness game, there's this pressure to look the part, right? So a lot of people are almost foregoing this opportunity to push their body weight to new all-time peaks because they have to post pictures of their physique on social media, and they want to look the part every single day, and they basically they get uncomfortable pushing to those new highs because they're kind of scared of how they'll look and how their followers will perceive that. But I think as far as like the history of bodybuilding goes, and in the natural bodybuilding world, I like talking about like the Alberto Nunez bulk, right? Like we all heard about how Alberto got up to like 250 pounds or whatever. And you hear a lot of other natural bodybuilders who went through these periods where they, the folk, right? Where you just, you push the food, you push the training, and, maybe their body composition got a little sloppy, but it also seems like a lot of the most jacked individuals in this field went through a period like that, or at least similar to that at some point in their careers. I mean, how do you guys kind of feel about that anecdotally?
Yeah, for sure. Just to add on the Birdo thing, Birdo was probably one of the first people that actually got me into natural bodybuilding. Him and following Matt Ogus as well. I'm sure Steve was the same, I think, Matt Ogus. And it's cool to see Matt tagging you in some of his stories. Yeah, I get very jealous about that, by the way.
Crazy.
Yeah, so I think that the big push up for me was where I built sort of the baseline of my muscle tissue. And this is something that I massively encourage, especially to my younger clientele, is that you've got to almost just get that initial bit of, dare I say it, fluff on to get strong enough on all the movements that you need to be strong enough, have enough stability, and really sort of venture into that path of being able to have enough muscle to legitimately step on stage and do very, very well. Because a lot of people do in this day and age get dragged into the idea of competing. The barrier to entry is now lower. There's classes like physique where you can jump in, and they see it as a class where, there's less muscle here, and sometimes there's actually not, and it's just all about shape and structure. So the barrier to entry, especially in females as well, is lower. So people aren't doing as many of these big push-ups that really need to be done to establish the baseline tissue. When I was 17 years old, I pushed up to pretty much the same body weight that I got to before my 2017 prep. So I had a lot less muscle, and I was pretty fat, but I was just told by sort of the flex magazines and the bodybuilding culture that I was following that you just had to eat big to get big kind of thing. And it's a bro sciencey thing, but to an extent there's merit in it. And I think there is actually, you know, in a lot of some of the bro sciencey terms, there is still some merit to be taken from it, and it's just about dissecting that with a critical eye, and that is something that Steve is very good at as well. So yeah, I'll let you give your opinion, Steve, on that.
Yeah, definitely. I think you said a lot of good things in that regard, and like anecdotally, it's completely true. You see virtually any of the top natural pros, and they've all had these kind of what you'd maybe some people would see as like sloppy masses or sloppy bulks, and they bulked. And I think that was something that I sold myself on too heavily, and I sold myself on the fact that I did bulk because I had previously got up to 190 pounds, and I was like, I'm never going to get that heavy again. And that was like in my first ever bulk, I'd got to that point, and it was uncomfortable. I didn't feel great. I didn't like it. And then you could, if you do enough research into things, you can sell yourself on anything. Like you can find a study to say anything if you want to. And I got sold on, oh, you can only gain this much muscle in this like period of time. Like if you get fatter, then like P ratios will just be destroyed or whatever it might be. And I think, yeah, you can just become confirmation bias if you want to. And I think that just didn't help. And I think something AJ is really great at doing, and I'm making sure to be better at, is selling people on performance over the physique in the off season. I think a lot of people hear it, and I don't think many people actually buy into it. Fortunately for me, like my social media and my kind of presence has never been sold on my physique. I don't feel like it may have taken more that way as I've got better, but
I think it has now.
Maybe now, but it never was. And so I never felt the pressure to stay a certain way. It was all in my own head. I only had it on myself, because I look back at some of the photos where I stayed leaner in an off season. And I'm like, I mean, I might be leaner, but I look really small and just like, it's not impressive. And it can be really hard. And I think it's really cool that AJ works with a lot of younger guys, because I think younger guys probably struggle the most to push up, because if you don't have much muscle under there, it doesn't look great when you push up. Whereas once you've got some, like, you just kind of look big and it can look quite decent. I think that helped. And I eventually got there as things look better and better as you go there. But in terms of, I was just, as we were discussing this, the study on sumo wrestlers recently came up in a chat somewhere. I can't remember where I saw it. And I was like reading over it, and they have like the biggest fat-free mass index. And it's like, obviously sumo wrestlers are just ridiculously fat, and people are like, oh yeah, why don't we all just like push up into sumo fat, like that kind of Jabba Hut sort of zone. And obviously you lose the muscle as you diet down, even if there was some muscle memory there. So there's limits to it. But I mean, it does say like that the kind of some of the fattest individuals in the world have the biggest fat-free mass index, and obviously there's more to fat-free mass index than muscle, but it's like you can't ignore that along with all the anecdote. So I think to not push body weight up, like progressive overload, has to occur on so many different levels.
Yeah, no, really fantastic back and forth by each of you. More on that point about the study on sumo wrestlers, Steve, kind of related, is that like in this field of like a surplus, and again, you can only grow so much muscle, so use a conservative surplus. And like the studies that are typically brought up are the Garf study, I think from 2013. And then you have the recent Verbiero paper, which Schoenfeld was involved in. And in both of these, they saw that the group that utilized a higher surplus gained way more body fat, right? So they're like, oh, it's definitely not worth it. But like if you look into the nuances, and again, there's issues with like measuring hypertrophy and stuff, right? But like the groups, they gain more body fat, but they also gained a little bit more muscle. So like there's that trade-off in that your future contest prep might have to be longer. But again, if you plan appropriately and you're like 3 years out or whatever, what's it matter if your body fat's a little bit higher if you can gain a little bit more muscle, which in the natural community, that little bit more muscle, totally worth it, right?
Yeah. I completely, I'm with you. And it's something I don't even look at or focus on now, is that kind of thinking about, oh, I can only gain a pound of muscle a month. I just don't even, I just eat. I make sure body weight goes up, not a silly level, check how things are going, make sure training is really good, and like trust that process. And like, it's an oversaid word, but I think a lot of people get too obsessive about the scale and fluctuations, and they end up biting themselves in the arse. And with those studies, like there's a lot of good with science, and I love science, but I mean, there's so little data on like bodybuilders gaining muscle through a surplus, and the level of trainee of these people, even if they're quote unquote advanced trainees within the literature, like especially that, I don't know if it was Garth, I can't remember who it was, maybe it was Garth, Garth is making me think of the intermittent dieting approach, but maybe it was Garth. I think it may. Anyway, it doesn't matter who it was, but I know exactly the study you're talking about because it gets used a lot. And I remember reading it, and I was like, these guys they're doing bodybuilding, but they're also doing their own sport that they're doing alongside. I'm like, come on, like if they put everything into their bodybuilding, surely the guys with a bigger surplus could have gained even more muscle. So I am more of the favor of make sure the body weight's going up, because we want to put everything into this. And sure, there's probably people who maybe they are doing multiple sports, maybe they are kind of having to have different commitments, and they're kind of limited to the amount they can train, and they can't put everything into it. So you'd be silly to push as much of a surplus, and that's where you have to individualize these sort of things. But for me and AJ, who want to gain every single ounce of muscle we want to, it makes complete sense to be a little bit more, I think, on the assertive side rather than holding ourselves back. I always use the analogy of gaining muscles like that cycling uphill, right? It's just so hard. Like, you don't want to do anything that's going to make that journey more difficult. So make sure you're in a surplus that's reasonable.
Yeah. Just to add a little bit on like the research study side of things and gaining a certain amount of muscle per year or whatever, I think the biggest problem with that is a self-limiting mindset. It's the biggest problem in natural bodybuilding. And a lot of people are limited by the thought of you can only look like this as a natural, or you can only gain this as a natural, or even lift this as a natural. Like, I surround myself with people that are not only ahead of me, but are also assisted. So I always, not that you should do this as a natural, but I always have a massive gauge. Like my gauge for where I should be is all the way up here. So like when gyms are open and things like that, and I have a training partner's, luckily for me, professional in the IFBB, you know, so the levels of where I'm setting my heights are extremely, and I can tell you for a fact, even if you just use Instagram as looking at their lifts as motivation, or watching some of their training videos, or watching people that can move more weight than you or more accurate than you or whatever, to use that as something to seek self-improvement, it will make a ginormous change to your physique. You know, environment is a thing, yes, and me and Steve have had discussions about this, about his training facility in the past. We've had back and forth discussions, and it is a thing, but you create your environment. Like, you decide as to whether you enter the gym and you're motivated by someone who's, you know, squatting 110 next to you, or whether you're watching someone on a video or thinking about someone on a video who's squatted 180 for perfect reps. And I know you look up to Jared a lot, Steve, and his form, his execution, and the loads he moves are incredible. And you probably look at some of them and think, I want to chase that down, kind of thing. And I think that's an important thing for athletes to focus on, rather than thinking, oh, I'm natural, I'm never going to get there, or I'm never going to lift that, or whatever. Just don't set those limiting thoughts, because you're already sort of creating a dead end or a ceiling for yourself, which you can definitely surpass if you've got the mindset to do it.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Just really cool insight there. Definitely something for everyone to take to heart when they're considering about, you know, their pursuit in this journey and what they can actually achieve. Don't put those limits on yourself, you know, see what you can make happen if you just put your all into it. With that being said, fellas, let's dive into more of like the nuances of this extended period of positive energy balance. So compared to your most recent off season to prior ones, did you do anything specific in regards to your macronutrient breakdown of the diet? Steve, what comes to mind when I think of you potentially is like high carbohydrate massing, and it doesn't seem like it's talked about nearly as much more recently, but within like the past 2 years or so, I feel like this got pretty popular concept by Mike Israetel. So did that play a major part in your most recent off season, or anything else?
So I actually don't know what I did before I did high carb massing. I may have done high carb massing, but I think I probably, when I think about it, I was heavily influenced by 3DMJ and their approach. And I think from what I still think today, I think they're more of a protein and calories. That's as far as they kind of take it. As long as you're getting the total calories you need to, and you're hitting your protein. Don't worry where your fats and carbohydrates lie. I think there's a lot to be said for that. I think that can achieve a heck of a lot. But I think when you are pushing again, when we're talking about myself and AJ, we're kind of unique individuals in that we're trying to do everything we can to possibly get that extra percentage point. And I think there's a decent amount of theoretical rationale from kind of the higher carb, massing phase. And I really only became aware of that, or rather thought about it, because I don't think it was like aware, like it was happening. And I think bodybuilders have done higher carbs for years. And this was from Broderick Chavez. And he's come on the podcast a few times. And then he heavily influenced my decision to go down the route of, trying to keep my fats a bit lower. And it makes a lot of, I like the science. And when people talk me through and kind of give me all the rationale behind it, I'm like, okay, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I am not someone who's particularly picky with food. I absolutely do not agree that we're all robots and just food is fuel, but I can almost approach my nutrition like that within a certain schema. So the higher carbohydrates, in terms of the fact that you're going to get a higher insulin kind of just net across the entire time, which is anti-catabolic. Carbohydrates help lower cortisol levels. So that's a good thing generally. Obviously, cortisol can contribute to muscle growth, but not in the context of what I'm talking about in terms of nutrition. You're going to have more glycogen. When muscles are full of glycogen, generally that's just a good anabolic signal to the muscle, better for performance, better for recovery. You generally have better pumps when you're full of glycogen. So it should just have a better total net anabolic effect from having this higher carbohydrate approach. But that's ensuring you do have enough fats. I'm not saying go zero fat. I tend to go 0.3 grams per pound, up to 0.6 grams per pound. So I will waver within the range. I tend to go to the lower end because, again, I'm kind of that person who thinks if there's anything I can get from being at the lower end, even if there isn't, I will go there. As long as I'm getting my essential fatty acids from eating fish during the week, fatty fish during the week, or supplementing with omega-3s, and then the majority of the fats I do consume, I'm trying to get from monosaturated sources. So we're thinking nut butters, nuts, avocados, those sort of things, olives. As long as I'm doing that, I'm pretty happy. I wouldn't say high carb massing is the healthiest mass you can do, because I think the literature is fairly clear that if you're going to overeat on anything, monosaturated fats, the Mediterranean style of diet is probably the healthiest route to go down, but I don't think that's the most anabolic route to go down. So I do go for high carb mass, but if if there's a reason to go eat out and I need to, it's not very socially acceptable and it can be very difficult, I will let fats come up during my lower volume periods when I'm not trying to push body weight up, I'm just maintaining. My fats will come much higher. So I do get kind of a bit of a psychological break from that, because it's wearing. You're very limited to certain foods if you kind of cap your fats at such a point, especially when I'm eating above 500 grams of carbs during a mass, up to 600 or plus. So that can be kind of challenging. And then cutting phases, I think it's always been bodybuilders just kind of go for the higher carbs, because there's multiple reasons why you do that during the cutting phase.
Yeah, I agree with pretty much everything you're saying in terms of the efficiency of going down the high carbohydrate route and the benefits that you may get out of it. I think the only limitation that I found with not just myself, but with clients as well, is when you get to the upper thresholds of, the 550, 650 carbohydrates and the appetite's diminishing, it becomes a point of you almost think of the diminishing returns you're getting from feeling so uncomfortable day to day that you have to simply add in slightly more dietary fats to make your diet a little bit more sustainable, especially if you've got room to push, or someone's got, a very adaptive metabolism on the way up, and you're just adding food and adding food and adding food, they're just sucking it all up. It gets a little difficult to manage that. So I would say it's definitely good up to a point, and then with some people individually, they'll have to go down different routes. And I'm a fan of, especially when appetite gets a little poorer. I know that Steve tends to keep calories pretty linear throughout the week, training versus rest. I am actually a fan of dropping the food down a little bit on the rest days, and dropping carbohydrates from 2 or 3 of the first few meals of the day, just to give your body a little bit of a break from eating the same damn thing all the time, waking up, eating your oats, waking up and, drinking a shake of dextrose and, just to basically give the palate something different. So starting with like a higher fat breakfast, a meal 1, 2, and 3 kind of thing. I think there have been discussions that you've had on your podcast, Steve, about the whole insulin sensitivity malarkey. I'm not a huge believer that it massively impacts that, because at the end of the day, if you're backloading carbohydrates, your blood glucose is probably just going to come straight back up to where it was anyway, and you're not really going to get any benefits, or at least nowhere near the benefits that I'm getting, for example, by being hypercaloric for a long period of time. So yeah, that's the only thing I would really to add to that. I think carbohydrates on the way out of a diet as well, like they're just so great at helping you recover from the diet, replenishing your physique and bringing up training performance. And at that point, post diet, it doesn't matter how many carbs you're on, you can get them down, because it's enjoyable. But there is a threshold where it starts to get a little bit tough.
Can I just ask? Sorry, AJ, it's because it's something I've been thinking about a bit more recently, was undulating calorie intake during a mass phase, because most of the time I don't, unless people are training like fewer days, like 4 or less. I tend to then I do have training and rest day calories. But do you find with yourself and clients that appetite's better, like the lower calorie days upregulate appetite into the next days?
Yes, I do find that there is a little shift in appetite. The other rationale behind doing this sort of thing is I find a lot of clients, especially now in lockdown, and they're either in furlough or they're working from home, cognitive function is poorer in an off season when they get up and the first thing they eat is carbs, because they find that they get that sort of blood sugar spike, and then it obviously starts to come down and down and down and down, and you sort of get that uneven balance in blood glucose. So I find if they have something either a little lower in carbs or none, and focus on fats and proteins, they just feel a little bit. I feel a lot better with that kind of meal approach to the first couple of meals of the day, even when I'm dieting normally. Just because of I think there's just something going on there that people feel better. And yeah, I think that's pretty much the answer, dude. Appetite wise, sometimes people just really suck at appetite in general, and even the lower calorie days just don't help. But most of the time they do help a little bit.
Interesting. Yeah, it's something as I when I got to my peak mass, as AJ was talking about, sometimes you have to get uncomfortable. I'd never got uncomfortable. I'd always been like, I can always eat more. It wasn't until I was pushing beyond 195 pounds at which it was kind of more horrendous actually than contest prep. And I can still say that, although I haven't done a prep for a while, but it was horrendous pushing past that limit.
You had a lot of issues, didn't you, man?
Yeah, there was multiple issues. I don't know exactly what it was, but maybe some undulation in cap, like having higher and lower days, that maybe would have helped. So maybe. I'm definitely interested in potentially letting go a bit of the higher carbs and letting my fats come up. I kind of get a bit set on a route, and I become a bit obsessive. And like, if I can't do it, I'm like, no, I'll break my body instead.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I can certainly attest to what AJ is saying as well. That's something I've been experimenting with recently. For example, I had a low day yesterday, and today I actually wanted breakfast. You know what I mean? Which is like something that isn't very common, during an extended period of a caloric surplus. So I think it can help with appetite. And then I've actually been working on an article, and I think based on the research, again, when we're talking about that 1% and this and that, I think there could be some potential health and body composition benefits from cycling carbohydrates and just overall calories on an acute basis. But with the kind of acute changes in nutrition out of the way, let's talk about some more long-term forms of nutritional periodization. So throughout your approximate 3-year off season, how frequently did you use mini cuts or brief dieting periods, and around how long did you run these for, and approximately like how much body weight did you aim to lose during these periods? AJ, why don't you start us off here?
Okay, so I did 2. Both pretty similar times, around summer of 2018 and summer of 2019. Yes, and I did them both for, the 2018 one was a little too long. It ended up being about 9 weeks long. So it wasn't really a mini cut. It was more of a diet. Just because I just stupidly extended it too long. It was just too long. Simple as, I just made a mistake there. And actually, I think I was talking to you, Steve, at that time. We were voice noting back and forth about it all. And then the other one was definitely more controlled. It was more accurate, and I just got it done. And I'd learned my lesson that, I think I dropped calories a little too slow. I was still in that sort of prep mindset of having to sort of hold on to food and protect food. And I didn't really need to have that because obviously it was a really, really short diet. So yeah, and then the second one was like 6 weeks. It coincided with a holiday, which was good, but it was timely. I needed to get it done just to improve my fitness. And the goal with these mini cuts always for me is to almost precede it with another more effective gaining phase following that. I'm sure Steve is exactly the same. It's just to basically reignite the fire, or put more fuel in the tank and be able to travel further, whatever you want to call it. Like, it's just a re-up. And by the point of a mini cut, I always make sure with myself and my clients, like, I am 100% ready to do a mini cut, because the worst thing you can do is mini cut when you're not ready to diet. Because it's aggressive. It will form or build upon all of the shitty relationship with food that you have if you had it, and bring back loads of annoying things if you left them behind in prep, and you bring them all back. It's just really frustrating. So as a rule of thumb, post-competition, I like to see, and I don't know whether this will be the same for you, Steve, but I had a common thing with all of my clients that prepped in 2019, because obviously I had quite a big roster, and I kept a lot of them on. So a lot of them are still working with me. I think I lost literally like 2 out of my 2019 roster. And every one of them have hit about anywhere between 30 and 35 weeks post-show and have done their first mini cut. So I don't know how that compares to you, Steve, but that was the length of time that I sort of had people stay in a surplus. And it came at the same point for all of them. Like, they just got soft enough to warrant it, and their mindset was ready for it. The calories were ready for it. And I always also, as a coach, when I say the idea of a mini cut, I don't just say, okay, next week you're mini cutting. I say, what do you think? Like, I'm saying the word mini cut. What comes to your mind when I say that? Do you like the idea, or do you think, fuck dieting? Sorry to swear. Screw dieting. And that's, I think, a really, really good thing to do, because you need to be a little bit more of like a communication tool for them when it comes to the word dieting, especially after a really long prep. So yeah, Steve.
I just want to comment on that last thing that you did there. And it must be, and I wonder how many coaches will be listening and saying they do the same thing, in terms of saying something and being like I can literally, what you said there in check-ins, I will do that all the time where I'll say something. I'm like, let me know what you think to what I've said there. Maybe I've answered your question, maybe I haven't. Like, just let me know what you think. So It's really interesting you do the same with mini cuts, and I can see exactly why. Because if you say the word mini cut to a client and they're suddenly like, oof, like their heart drops and they're like, oh shit. Or if it like makes them like, yeah, then like if you're itching for it, then you're good. But if it at all makes you think, oh no, then don't do it. Even if it's just a small amount, because like AJ said, these are aggressive. So and they should be used sparingly. So I ended up doing 3. And the first one I did take was almost 30 weeks. It was around like the 30-week mark after my competition. But I probably am not like a lot of people in that I was very slow coming out. Well, I was pretty slow. I wouldn't say I was very slow, maybe a little bit slower than I should have been. My body weight didn't really rebound very quickly. I maybe wasn't as pushy as I should have been. You're messing around with psychology at this point as well. And I think at that time, you can be lenient on people. I'll be lenient on myself and say, my body weight is going up. It maybe was just a bit slower than it should have been. And then I took the mini cut probably leaner than I should have. So if I was, in hindsight, looking back, I would have skipped that first mini cut and continued massing through and only had 2. So out of mine, though, I think the first one was, I tend to run them for 3 to 6 weeks. I think 2 of them were 3 or 4 weeks. And the last one was, I think, 4 weeks. So my mini cuts, very, very short. I tend to lose aim for 1 to 2% of body weight loss per week. Typically, it's on average 1%, and that's very aggressive. So these are, for me, like 1,000 calorie deficits. which when you're going from a massing intake to that, it's like a huge, huge shift in everything. But just like AJ said, I very much periodize these in concordance with my off season in a way to kind of, if I'm going to be sciencey, call it phase potentiation. I just like using the terminology because it sounds fancy. It sets you up for future success. And like it literally slingshots you back into a mass. You are like a lot of these things, and you look at crash diets. This is essentially a mini cut's kind of like a crash diet. It's propelling your appetite, it's propelling your body weight to come back up, and they almost help you get around that little bit of a plateau. They bring down body fat a little bit. They get you a bit more kind of fitter and a bit more leaner. So you hopefully respond to nutrients slightly better, and they just excel the rest of the off season. So I think they can be a really great part of someone's off season when used correctly. And unfortunately, I think a lot of competitors end up using them as like I fucked up my post show and now I'm going to mini cut. It's like, no. Just kind of maintain them at least for a bit of time because your psychology is not ready, even if your physiology is. So, yeah.
Great. Anything either the two of you want to add before we jump into training?
I'm good.
Alrighty. So let's get right into it then. This is a topic that I'm extremely keen to have both you provide your perspective on, because we do have some differences in perhaps the training methodologies here, where each of you found success, which is to be expected, right? We know that there are individual differences in how everyone responds to training, and while it can be quite challenging to figure out which variables work for you, it is worth exploring rather than just, copying what the biggest dude in your gym is doing. So as far as like a broad overarching concept here, let's just start with volume and frequency, since it is closely related. What differences were there in your volume and frequency this past off season compared to ones prior? AJ, start us off.
Okay, so in terms of my volume over the course of the last 2 years, so if I took my 2017 prep and put that into consideration and compared it to what I'm doing now, I'm definitely doing a lot less total volume than I was doing back then. And over the course of my off season, my volume gradually dropped. So over the course of 2018, it was coming down a little bit. 2019 came down some more. And then 2020, most recently over the last sort of 4 or 5 months or so, crazy, we're already halfway through the year. It's come down even further. Premise behind this, or rationale behind this, is that my ability to train harder has gone up. So every set has a greater degree of systemic demand or recovery toll. And bearing in mind that I train at high intensities on most sets for compound movements, the amount of total sets I can do is obviously going to be lower. It'll never be super high if I decide to train with that level of intensity. So that's volume. In terms of frequency, again, body part frequency has come down a little bit. Instead of hitting body parts every sort of twice across 7 days, it's normally now twice across 10 days instead of 7. So it's not changed drastically. I'm just having more rest around the workouts which are the most fatiguing. So my split currently is a split where I'll train push, then pull, then rest, then legs, then rest. So I rest either side of the lower body day. And that for me, I find that, and actually when the gyms are open as normal and I can basically get in frequently, I am doing arm days occasionally. I thought I'd just add that in there from a frequency standpoint. I'll maybe explain that later. So yeah, frequency is dropped a little bit, again, based on the same premise that my accuracy and my intensity has gone up. Like the way that I used to train in 2017 was very much in line with a little closer. I never really tracked RIR or RPE or any sort of, I did a little bit, but not much. But the way I trained was definitely more in line with the way that Steve trains now, in the sense that my goal would be to accumulate volume over several sets. So I might do 4 sets of something, and the last set would probably be the hardest of them all. and the first 2 or 3 would be slightly lower in terms of intensity. Like they definitely wouldn't be failure points, and there wouldn't really be a true failure point, or very rarely there'd be a spotted rep. And since then, since having training partners consistently through the back end of 2019 and 2020, there's been a lot of forced reps, not really forced, but like touches and things like that to take you into a little bit beyond your natural ability. And that again has to bring down my frequency, because again, I'm creating more of a systemic demand, more of a full body demand in terms of my recovery system, both physically and from a nervous system perspective as well, and neurologically, you know, going into a session knowing that you're going to have to take a rep from your training partner and things like that is not something you can do 6 times a week unless you want to be someone that doesn't have a business or a life, because it does beat you up a lot more. Obviously, conversely, and Steve will touch on this as well, I'm not saying that my way of training beats you up and Steve's doesn't, because I know Steve's training beats you up, because if I was to do his week 4 or week 5, I'd be fucking trashed. But it's a different kind of trashed. And I'm sure Steve will explain a little bit more. Did I cover everything? Volume, you just asked volume and frequency, right?
Yeah, that was all. Before we transition to Steve, I just want to quickly follow up there. Considering your success with bringing down the volume and the frequency, in the future, as you become more advanced, you become more resistant to growing, have you considered how you're going to progress this training style? Do you think that you're going to need more rest because you're going to be able to impose an even greater stimulus from set to set? Because I think right now in this community, with the fascination with volume, you know, most people are going to think, well, in order to induce progressive overload as you get more advanced, you need to perform more total volume. Or even just as bodybuilders in general, just our masochistic nature, we're like, well, why don't we just do more work? I can outwork my competition. If I just do more, that'll make me the best bodybuilder possible. So yeah. Have you thought about that?
My thoughts on that. I think you're very right in saying that there is a time where I'll probably have to take even more rest. I hope that it's not too soon, because I love training and I really, really struggle with my current split. Because I get to a rest day and I'm like, again? Like, because in 2017, I was training 6 days a week, every week. I'd have Sundays off. That'd be it. And I loved it. I love training. It's my favorite part of my day. So sometimes when the split rolls around and it's a week where I only train 4 times, I'm like, what am I going to do with myself? So luckily I've got a busy business, and you know, I can fill my days easily. You know, Steve will know there's always something you can do. But it's just the training part of the day that I really do like, and I miss on the rest days. But it is what it is, and I think that it's favourable for the way that I like to train. And yeah, in the future, I think more rest would probably be something that could be taken into consideration. But I think for me, it would just be a case of auto-regulation of volume within the session. So intra-session volume would just come down a notch. You know, the sessions I do aren't that low volume when you look at them. Like, there's the difference between the way Steve puts volume and mine is Steve will explain his way, but I do a lot more exercises from what I've seen. I'll do, you know, maybe some leg sessions could be 8 or 9 exercises, and I'm sure that's unheard of in Steve's leg days. So when you look at the session on paper, there's probably similar volume just spread across different exercises. And the reason why I do that is I believe that going from one exercise to another and having several different things to progress, especially when you're training at a higher threshold to failure, is just a little bit more efficient to try and get a little bit more linear progression going on. I think I would be more likely to hit, I'd be really likely to hit stalls if I was to take 4 sets or 5 sets of squats, all to the intensity that I take every set of squats that I do. You know, I think I leave an exercise and think that was the last set and that's all I can do. So yeah, to answer your question, more rest probably is going to happen in the future, but more just sort of a balance of intra-session volume and dropping things that are 2 sets down to 1, things like that. Yeah. That's my thoughts.
Steve?
Cool. So yeah, volume. Very interestingly, that AJ said his volume came down because I think mine did as well. I know post show. I think I was in that mindset of, I think I just didn't have the healthiest mindset, and it was that more is better. I have all this food coming in. I've got to make use of it. And so I don't think I would, back then, I'm sure I thought I did. But thinking in hindsight back to it, it can't have been. And I probably just wasn't in a healthy enough position to have good enough performance to really trash myself effectively enough. I just wasn't at a body kind of composition where I could work hard and cause much disruption. I was just weak and kind of recovering. So my sets got all like, I know I have some of the spreadsheets. I could look back and I was doing horrendous amounts of volume, much more than what I can achieve now. So my volume has definitely come down. It came down and then basically stabilized. So it doesn't look that different. I worked through my kind of minimum effective volume up to my max recoverable volume, but that doesn't look too different mesocycle to mesocycle and across the rest of my kind of off season. So my volume, it came down slowly, probably within the first year since like 2018, it probably came down. 2019 kind of steadied, and this year as well, it's probably steadied. My frequency, I've played around with frequency. I tend to just try and find kind of when I'm stressing a muscle group, when can I next train it? When's it recovered by? That's essentially what I'm looking for. And generally, if I'm doing more volume for a particular exercise or muscle group rather, and talking volume number of sets, if it's higher, I need to spread it across more days. Otherwise, like I'm just going to get into junk volume territory where I'm just going through the motions, not really getting anything out of those sets. Intent's not there, weight is maybe low, performance isn't there. So I have messed around with higher frequencies up to doing upper, lower, upper, lower, upper, lower, upper, lower. So 6 times a week, spreading it all across there. So that was like 12 sessions, splitting my back and chest. So like back AM, chest PM, hamstrings AM, quads PM, and then like rotating. And you have to be very careful when you go to that higher frequency, because I screwed it up the first time. I just have overlapping soreness going to sessions because you can't push. Like you can't have very challenging movements every single session. You have to really be careful about recovery sessions. And that's certainly something I'd say is, it's definitely, you need to do a needs analysis. You don't just jump to doing that. It's definitely not one of those more is not better. That quote you on that. Better is better. So I tried that and I think it worked pretty well. I may try it again in future when I'm really like for a single mesocycle and my volume tolerance is very, very high because I'm like really deep into an off season. But I've really settled to liking doing a push, a legs push pull, legs push pull split. And then splitting my sessions into AM and PM sessions for the most part. And in this off season, I have like things like biceps, delts, and calves, abs. They're at least 4 times per week. Sometimes they may even be higher than that. And I found those muscle groups just recover so fast. They can just take a severe beating. And sometimes some of them only need like 2 sets within a single session to feel like they've had good work. And I don't need to do any more for those muscle groups because along with the compound lifts, they've had sufficient work. So yeah, I've kind of been very analytical, very similar to AJ, and just found what frequencies working for me, what's jiving, what's leading to the best performance, best growth. And my volume overall came down, and it's something I am always assessing every single week, every session I'm in. I'm thinking, how disrupted is that muscle? How decent of a pump has that muscle got? How am I feeling? And if I'm like wrecked after 2 sets, I'm not doing more that session. Even if I program 3 or 4, I'm auto-regulating for that session. And then I'll carry that into my next session. Be like, right, I did less there. How am I feeling for this one? And so that's something I've got way better at, is understanding my body and its needs in terms of volume. And so I don't know, you can ask me off the top of my head, like, what's your week 1 volume for that muscle group, blah, blah, blah. I don't have it all it's in a spreadsheet, but I don't like table it out or anything, because I'm just listening to how I'm responding at the time. Because even every single exercise you do, you respond differently to them all. Like I could do 2 sets on like leg press versus a kind of a belt squat or a back squat. I'm going to get different stimulus through the quads. I might need 3 or 4 or 2 for various things. So that's something I'd say has been a big change for me in terms of my off season. And then also similar to AJ, I have got more from less because I've just had better intent. And my 3 RAR, 4 RAR, a true 3, 4 RAR, and they are like somewhat difficult. Like they're not like balls out hard sets. There's definitely not, but they're hard. And I'm sure there was a time where those were probably closer to 5, 6. So I've definitely dialed in. My RAR is much better, which is great. So yeah, it's all just been a learning curve and continually learning the body and changing things as I need to.
As we were kind of talking about before the podcast and what ended up happening, some people might be surprised when they listen to this training discussion. They're like, oh, the take-home point from both Steve and AJ was to get more from less. Like, what? I didn't expect them to have that same exact conclusion based on their training styles. So it sounds like for the both of you, being analytical about the process, having a better understanding of your recovery, what frequency and volume suits you best. Steve, for you, probably getting a better understanding of what your true MEV to MRV progression should look like. Can you expand a little bit more on the 2 times per day training? When exactly you started implementing that, and I guess you have seen significant differences in regards to the quality of your training sessions by splitting it up that way?
So yeah, I think I started in 2017 in my prep. And that was when I was consulting with Jared Feather, who was doing twice daily training. And he was just, I saw him doing it. And as ever, you kind of look at someone who's above you and you're like, shouldn't I be doing that? And that's not always the case. It's definitely not always the case. Like, you shouldn't be looking at what they're doing you should look at what they did to get where they are, not what they're currently doing at their level. So again, very careful to do a needs analysis for that. But spoke to Jared and he was comfortable with me using that. And for my job, when a gym's really close, especially in contest prep, it just allowed me to get my steps up, and it just suited my lifestyle quite nicely, where I don't have a heck of a lot going on. I can quite easily use it to break up my work day. So from a lifestyle perspective, it was a plus. And then it has good kind of recovery benefits in terms of, like, I can do a pull session and then be fresh to come and hit my biceps again. And for the way that I train, and I can see it not working if you were kind of training like very hard and so you're just wrecked for the PM session. I can definitely see that, and particularly in the weeks 4 or 5 where I am within a mesocycle and I have done a very hard session, sometimes that PM session is not something I particularly want to go and do, but I get it done. And I think because you've adapted, right, so I built up to that, so it's not like it's just completely out there and completely difficult to do. I've kind of each week I've slowly adapted to it, mindset and my physiology. So yeah, the twice daily training, essentially at the pure basics of it, it tends to look like compound movements are done in the morning or earlier in the day, and then maybe 4 or 5 hours, 6 hours later, I'll do my accessory movements. So that might be my compound, or rather my chest musculature. So you don't want to do overlapping. So I wouldn't do like my bench press and then cable flies later, because I've just gone and wrecked my chest with bench press and now it's recovering, and now I'm going to go stress it again when it hasn't recovered and adapted in time. So it's kind of stressing compound lifts, the main musculature that you're trying to hit for the day. So that might be like my chest, and then later in the day I can finish off my triceps, as they maybe got a bit of stimulus from my compound work, but they're not like overly stressed, and I can give them more quality repetitions, getting more quality volume during that PM session. It isn't like I'm training like another whole entire session, which I had to learn, and I had to bring back volume and be okay with 20-minute sessions, like in the first week of my mesocycle, which can be uncomfortable at times, but I've got much better at that. And just, again, listening to my body, actually thinking about what is this training doing to me. And that's something I'm really careful to try and get across to clients is, like, I don't know when I used to do bodybuilding training and I just did the session and just tick the boxes, and I didn't think about how it affected me. I just was like, oh, if I did that, it was a good session. It's like, no, actually, how did everything feel? Like, I'm just so, it sounds really like bro-ish, I guess, because I'm taking like the same mentality they do. It's like actually feeling how it's like you're responding to everything. So yeah, I don't know where I'm going or if that explained the twice daily training, but that's how it tends to look. And it came from, and I didn't used to split up my leg sessions, but I slowly started to do those as I found that I could give more to like hamstrings or quads, but I did find the kind of in-session systemic fatigue was just too much. If I trained one beforehand, I was just too fatigued to hit the other one with due diligence. So I end up splitting those up as well. And sometimes that's not fun. And I, at one point, was trying to do compound lifts in both AM and PM session, and that did not last long. So I'd do like high bar squats in the morning and then like straight leg deadlifts in the evening. And yeah, that was too much. Yeah, definitely.
You pushed
cool.
the limit out there, mate. Jeez.
Yeah, those weren't successful.
No, I bet. Goodness
Lots
me.
of really good tips for anyone considering implementing this type of approach. But it is really cool that not only you found some benefits in terms of training adaptations, but as far as a lifestyle component, you thought this fit your lifestyle really well, which is a nice aspect of it. So, gentlemen, let's move into our last topic of discussion for today, and that's whether either of you spent a large portion of time trying to improve a specific muscle group. So, AJ, did you utilize any specialization phases throughout your most recent off season?
At the back end, I did, yes. I introduced an arm day, which, funnily enough, I was on another podcast earlier today, and we discussed this, how I think the arms, just for people that aren't gifted with good arm genetics, Steve, you avoid in this conversation. It's the arms sometimes just need a little extra, and there's a difference between the feeling that you get hitting arms on their own day versus the feeling you get in your arms after hitting them at the end of push or pull. It's just completely different. It's just a completely different feeling. Like, yes, you could say, oh, but it's a completely different feeling when you do just chest on its own or just delts on its own. It is, yeah, agreed. But you still have that when you do a push day, you're very focused for your incline dumbbell press or your high incline dumbbell shoulder press. You're on it for those movements. But then at the back end of the session, it's arms. It's a little boring. You do some curls. Like, arm training is never that fun at the end of a hard session. And if you've had a bad session, it's even worse because you're like, oh, fuck this, just like arms. They're always going to, I always just think, oh, they're just always going to be a bit rubbish. So I put my effort in, but I never really trained them as hard as I probably should have done in hindsight, just because I just didn't ever find them fun. So I thought, okay, what's the best way to make arm training fun? Put them on their own, do a ton of supersets. So I just do 3 to 4 back-to-back supersets and just 2 to 3 sets on each one. So it'll be like bicep, tricep, bicep, tricep, bicep, tricep. And then that'll be my arms done. And this is something that I've only implemented with myself and either 1 or 2 other clients at the moment. They just have like really stubborn arms and they're just not growing. And I must admit that even within 2 weeks of doing it, I noticed a difference just because of them being more inflamed. Like, the inflammation was causing some cell swelling that almost had an immediate aesthetic effect. That was not muscle gain, by the way, so don't get too excited about that, listeners. But along that road, obviously progressively overloading a little bit, I'm not really closely logging these sessions, especially at the moment, given the circumstances. When I get back into the gym, of course, I will be logging these sessions and paying more of a close eye to the numbers that I'm actually hitting. But it's kind of nice to go in and do that day and think, right, I've not got the pressure of hitting a huge lift. I've just got to realistically get a big pump. And I've seen a lot of other people doing it as well. Sometimes even people are doing arms and delts together. So they'll just do arms and then sort of metabolic style delts. So just side raises, cuff lateral raises, etc. A couple of sets, maybe 1 rest pause. Jobs are good. And I've even thought of doing like a bit of an art, like in the future off season, doing on one of my days in this current split, which will probably be the 3rd day, which is the rest before legs, doing like an arms and a little bit of metabolic chest, just because chest's always been a weak point for me. Again, screw you, Steve. You have all of my weak body parts and they're strong. So that's the only thing I really focused on. And besides that, it was literally, for me, it was a case of just getting everything bigger because everything needed to be bigger. I was too small for my goals, the next goals that I had. So we will soon see whether I'm big enough for my goals now, but I hope I'm a little bit closer at least.
It's really interesting. I was just going to say, it's really interesting hearing you talk about the benefits of an arm day, because effectively that's kind of like I'm splitting my AM and PM up. And essentially one of the reasons you do that is because you can't hit that muscle group sufficiently within that session. So you move it later. Yeah. So a lot of the benefits you're kind of talking about there are very similar to the benefits I found from splitting those training sessions up. So that's really cool. Yeah, for me, for specialization, I'm really hesitant to go down that route. I wonder if AJ feels the same way about this, because the necessity of specializing almost means you have to put something else on the back burner. And I don't want to not grow everything. And I could grow some body parts at a slower pace to get more out of some other body parts. But I haven't truly committed to a true specialization phase where I am putting some body parts at maintenance or even like lower volume and just pushing others. So I have done kind of focused mesocycles. So I've definitely focused on quads and back at periods of time. No other muscle groups I've really focused on. And by focused, I just mean particularly like exercise selection, making those my kind of prime movements, maybe making other muscle groups using less fatiguing movements so that I can put more towards those ones. And then also exercise order. So I would put them first within sessions. And the reason I do legs push pull is because I want that leg session to come after that rest day, because for me, legs is just an area I want them to be as big as they possibly can be. And that's an area I feel like is a weaker part for me. I very nicely, Andrew Chappelle, actually, when I did some posing with him, said that I have a very balanced physique, which was really nice to hear. But that doesn't really help me in terms of making me want to specialize, because I think I am probably getting to a point where I've been training over 10 years now. I'm probably getting to that like advanced level where I am struggling to push everything, because I'm kind of getting a little bit from everything, whereas I could get a lot from one thing and then move and get a lot from something else. And maybe I'll move towards specializing in kind of future off seasons. But right now, yeah, I'm just focused on bringing everything up. And I think specialization is probably one of those advanced things that a lot of people, like, you hear about a lot, and probably not many people need to do it. Maybe some people want to do it, and that's a different story. Like if you just want huge arms, then sure, you can specialize on those. But if you want to be the best bodybuilder you can be, you don't want to specialize until you need to specialize, I don't think. And like AJ said, just bring everything up. And same for me, I was definitely like, I remember one of my feedback from the judges, and this just puts it so well, is Steve has like for the frame he's got, he needs more muscle on that frame. Like he can carry more muscle, and like they're obviously assuming quite a lot, but I completely agree. I look at my frame, I'm like, it just doesn't look bodybuilder yet. And I think I'm getting there now where I've got enough muscle on this frame so it looks reasonable. So yeah, I haven't truly specialized.
Some excellent points. What I think is really cool is how you each kind of go about it in a different approach. So, in the prototypical specialization phase, maybe you increase volume for one or two body parts and decrease volume on everything else, right? But it doesn't have to exactly work that way. Steve, like you said, you could have a focused mesocycle where you're just adjusting exercise selection or picking certain movements to prioritize the muscle, or like AJ said, just giving that muscle its own day. And it can be as simple as that in order to drive those adaptations a bit further. But that is all I have for each of you today. Before we wrap things up here, if you got anything to plug, throw it out there where people can find out a little bit more about you guys.
Steve, I'll let you take it first.
Yeah, thank you for having us on. It's actually been a really fun chat, and there was no fisticuffs or online fisticuffs as some people might imagine there to be. So I knew there would never be, obviously. But I think some people, yeah, it's weird the kind of view from the outside that people get. But anyway, you can find me. ReviveStronger.com has our coaching team, has our members site on there, has all of our podcasts, any old articles that are still maybe relevant to people. And they can find me on Instagram at Revive Stronger. That's where I'm most present, and they can ask me questions in my DMs if they want to, or just follow along my journey and content over there. And that'd be amazing. And yeah, we have the main kind of content that we put out at Revive Stronger is the Revive Stronger podcast. So if they're listening to this and they love this sort of information, they get to hear me interview some of the people I think are the smartest in the industry. So yeah, it's really cool to be able to do that. But yeah, that's me.
Yeah, and similar for myself. So AJ Morris _ on Instagram. I've got my site at Made by Morris Coaching, which is got a member site, similar sort of Steve's member site, in the sense that it's both educational, motivational, follow my journey a little bit more. Got a forum with my clients logging in there as well as myself. And yeah, and then the podcast as well on YouTube. So just search AJ Morris and I'll be there. I've got recent ones with some natural bodybuilding greats that you might not have heard of, but you should have heard of. And if you haven't, then go and check them out, because there's some gold anecdotes in there and stories to be told about the past of natural bodybuilding. So if you're interested in knowing a little bit more about the history of the sport, then head across. But thank you very much, Mike, for having us on, man. Really appreciate it. And like Steve said, we very much enjoyed the chat, and it's lovely to sort of sit down with you guys.
Yeah, this has been absolutely fantastic. I know the listeners are going to enjoy this just as much as I have. So to our listeners, thank you so much for listening. Per usual, you can check out the video content for this episode on the Muscle Memoirs YouTube, and we're also available on all major streaming platforms. That includes Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Stitcher Radio. Until next time.